the morning of May 21st, 1997, in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, a 47-year-old computer analyst named Jack Barsky walked out of his front door, briefcase in hand, and found two strangers standing in his driveway who were not there by accident. Barsky stopped. The men identified themselves as agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of them spoke first. According to Barsky's own subsequent account, given in interviews and in his 2017 memoir, the agent told him that they knew who he was and where he had come from. Barsky looked at them for a moment. Then he said he was relieved the day had finally arrived. What Jack Barsky's neighbors on that residential street in Montgomery County saw that morning, if any of them happened to glance out their windows, was an unremarkable exchange between a middle-aged man and two other men near a parked car. Nothing that would have drawn particular attention, nothing that would have suggested anything of consequence was occurring. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that suburban Pennsylvania neighborhoods are quiet on weekday mornings after the school buses have gone and before the day fully begins. What was actually occurring was the conclusion of one of the longest-running Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil, and the beginning of a reckoning that would take years to fully absorb. The man standing in that driveway had been born Albrecht Dittrich on July 25, 1949, in Glauchau, a small industrial city in what would become the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. He had been recruited by the KGB, the Soviet Committee for State Security, in the early 1970s while studying chemistry at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. He had been trained for years and given a false identity constructed from the death record of an American child who had died in Brooklyn in 1955. He had crossed into the United States in October 1978 and had been living inside the country, working, building relationships, raising children, attending to the full texture of ordinary American life, under that stolen name for 19 years. The FBI had known who he was for approximately 9 of those years. They had been watching him without approaching him, building their understanding of his situation, waiting for the right moment and the right approach. The moment had arrived. He had come to the door. If you find yourself drawn to the documented stories of Cold War intelligence and the real human cost behind them, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week, this channel brings you the verified record behind some of the most consequential secrets of the 20th century. Now, back to that driveway in Lansdale, and the man standing in it with decades of other people's assumptions at his back. The house in Lansdale sat in a neighborhood of comparable houses in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, 25 miles north of Philadelphia. It was modest in the way that most of the houses on most of the streets in most of the suburbs of American mid-sized cities are modest, maintained, comfortable, unremarkable. The lawns were tended. The cars in the driveways were family vehicles of the mid-1990s variety. The children who lived on the block went to school and came home and played in the way that children in such neighborhoods played. By 1997, Jack Barsky had been living in the area for several years, having relocated from New Jersey in the early part of the decade. His wife, Shauna, had married him, knowing him as Jack Barsky, an American man with the background he had sketched only in the broad strokes that most people accept about the people they meet and come to love. They had children together, a daughter named Chelsea, a son named Nikita. The children were American-born in every sense, growing up in the ordinary manner of children in ordinary suburban households, doing homework and attending birthday parties, and fighting over the television remote in the evenings. Barsky's professional life by the mid-1990s reflected a trajectory that had become increasingly common in that era. He had educated himself in computer programming and information technology during the early 1980s, when the personal computer industry was expanding fast enough that practical skill and demonstrated competence often mattered more than formal credentials. He had worked his way through a series of positions at companies in New York and later New Jersey and Pennsylvania, building a professional profile that was, by 1997, entirely respectable. Among his employers had been Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, MetLife, where he had worked as a data analyst. His work required no security clearance. It provided no access to classified materials. It gave him proximity to nothing except the insurance industry's data management infrastructure. He commuted to work on weekdays. He came home in the evenings. He participated in the ordinary exchanges of neighborhood life without distinguishing himself through any behavior that his neighbors would later describe as unusual. He attended school events for his children. He drove the kinds of roads that people in Montgomery County drove every weekday morning without incident, without anyone looking twice at him. He was, by the late 1990s, what he appeared to be, a suburban American professional with a family and a career and a house and a commute. What he was in legal fact, a KGB-trained illegal intelligence officer living under a stolen identity, was a description that fit no visible aspect of his daily life. The Soviet Union he had served had dissolved in December 1991. He had not communicated with any Soviet or Russian intelligence service in years. He was, in operational terms, a remnant, an intelligence officer without an active mission or an active organization to serve, and yet the FBI had not forgotten what he was. Albrecht Dittrich was born in the summer of 1949, 4 years after the end of the Second World War, in a country that was being reorganized from the ground up under Soviet political authority. The German Democratic Republic was formally established in October 1949, 2 months after his birth from the Soviet occupation zone of post-war Germany. It was the country in which he would grow up, be educated, and be shaped, a state that organized its citizens' lives within the framework of socialist ideology and the requirements of a centrally managed economy aligned with Soviet interests. His family occupied the position of ordinary citizens in that system. His father worked in the industrial economy that was the backbone of the East German state. Life in Glauchau was the life of a mid-sized German city, rebuilt and reimagined within the parameters of the new political order, constrained in some ways, stable in others, offering the kinds of modest prospects that such systems offer to people who do not attract particular attention from the authorities. Dittrich did attract a certain kind of attention. He was, by the accounts that have accumulated in the years since his case became public, an academically capable student, strong in science, attentive to language, intellectually curious in the way that the East German educational system, which invested heavily in identifying and developing technically gifted students, was structured to notice and reward. He was admitted to Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, one of the German Democratic Republic's respected institutions of higher learning, where he enrolled in a chemistry program in the late 1960s. It was at the university, as Barsky later described in his memoir, that the KGB's process of approach began. The recruitment followed a pattern that has been documented across dozens of Cold War accounts from defectors and former intelligence officers, a process designed to be gradual, to feel like the natural development of a relationship, rather than the engineered enrollment of an asset. The initial approach came through a person who presented as a faculty acquaintance or party contact and expressed interest in Dittrich's abilities and political reliability. Over subsequent conversations, the nature of what was being asked became progressively clearer: service to the socialist state in a capacity that would require him to work abroad, undercover, for an extended period, in a role that he was told would contribute to the prevention of miscalculation between nuclear-armed powers. The argument was not cynical in the original context. The East German educational system had immersed him in a framework in which the Cold War was a confrontation between socialist progress and American imperialism, a framework that, like all comprehensive ideological frameworks, felt from the inside not like propaganda but like a description of reality. He had been formed by this framework during the years when formation happens most completely, and the KGB's offer fit within it in a way that made the offer seem reasonable rather than monstrous. He agreed. He was in his early 20s. He was talented, ambitious, and operating within a world that provided him no framework in which the alternative to agreeing was obviously preferable. He had, at the time of his recruitment, a wife. Jolande was the woman he had married before his KGB engagement moved into its final operational phase. They had a son together, a boy named Matthias, who was young when the decisions were made that would remove his father from his life for more than a decade. What Yolanda was told about her husband's plans or his disappearance is not fully documented in public accounts. What is documented is that Dittrich left East Germany in 1978 without telling her the truth of where he was going or whether he was coming back. Matthias grew up without his father. The identity the KGB constructed for Albrecht Dittrich had been assembled from the documentary residue of a life that had ended prematurely. Jack Philip Barsky had been a real person, an American child born in Brooklyn, New York, who had died there in 1955 at the age of 10. The KGB's documentation specialists had located the death record and, working with the understanding that an American child who died young left few subsequent administrative traces, built from it the supporting structure of an adult life, a social security number, a biographical history that accounted for the gaps between the child's death and the adult's apparent existence, a paper record calibrated to survive normal administrative scrutiny. The fundamental vulnerability of this approach, that a check of birth records against death records would reveal that the person in question had died before they could have done any of the things the false record attributed to them, was a risk that the KGB's program accepted as manageable. The United States in the 1970s did not have a centralized cross-reference system that would automatically flag a Social Security application as inconsistent with a death record from a different city in a different decade. The fraud required only that the person presenting the documents was plausible, and Dittrich's training was specifically designed to produce plausibility. What that training involved, as Barsky has described in his memoir and in subsequent interviews, was comprehensive and extended over years. English was the first and most consuming element, not just fluency, which he had achieved through formal study, but the particular texture of American English, idiomatic usage, regional variation, the vocabulary of specific professional and social contexts, the behavioral register of a person who had grown up speaking the language rather than learned it in a classroom. His trainers worked on the residual traces of his native German in his speech, attempting to eliminate the phonological patterns that an attentive listener might notice. The work was granular and patient, the correction of specific vowel sounds, the adjustment of intonation patterns, the cultivation of the particular rhythms of American casual conversation that a non-native speaker produces with a different emphasis than a native one. The training extended well beyond language. He was given an extensive biographical education in the life of the person he was to become, not just the facts of that person's supposed past, but the texture of it, the sensory details that make a biographical narrative feel inhabited rather than recited. Where had Jack Barsky grown up? What had the schools been like? What memories would a person of his supposed background carry from childhood that would surface naturally in conversation rather than requiring deliberate retrieval? These questions needed answers, and the answers needed to be consistent, available quickly, and emotionally plausible, because the tell of a constructed biography is often not a factual error but an emotional one, the slight absence of feeling that attaches to a memory that has been learned rather than lived. He was trained in the specific geography and culture of the biographical history he would be presenting, the kind of knowledge that is granular enough to be convincing in sustained conversation, but that cannot be adequately conveyed by reading documents. He studied American popular culture, American political history, American sports and television, and the accumulated shared references that people use to establish the social fact of having grown up in the same country at the same time. The preparation was designed to produce a person who could walk into any ordinary American environment, a workplace, a neighborhood, a social gathering, and function within it, without generating the specific kind of attention that difference attracts. Beyond language, the training involved what intelligence practitioners describe as legend construction, the building of a detailed biographical narrative that a person can inhabit convincingly under questioning. Where had Jack Barsky grown up? Where had he gone to school? What had he done before his current job? Who were his family members? These questions needed answers that Dittrich could produce consistently and without hesitation, answers that were internally coherent, and that explained the various gaps and absences in the documentary record in ways that an ordinary person might find plausible. He was also trained in tradecraft, the mechanics of dead drops, counter-surveillance techniques, the protocols for communicating with handlers in ways that minimized the risk of detection. He learned to recognize surveillance, to vary his routes and routines in ways that would reveal a surveillance team without alerting them that they had been noticed. He learned the procedures for loading and unloading concealed package sites, the precise sequence of actions that made such exchanges possible without any direct contact between an agent and a handler. Albrecht Dittrich left East Germany in 1978. He crossed into the United States through Canada in October of that year, entering at a border point in the northeastern United States with documentation identifying him as Jack Philip Barsky, an American citizen. The documents were examined. They were accepted. He entered the country. He was 29 years old. He had a wife and a son in East Germany. He had a false name and a stolen history and a mission whose timeline had no defined end. New York City in the late 1970s was in a particular phase of its history. Financially strained, physically deteriorating in certain neighborhoods, but alive in the way that large cities remain alive, regardless of their institutional difficulties, full of the density and variety of human experience that makes a city useful as a place in which to disappear. For someone who needed to build a life from scratch, needed to establish the administrative traces of ordinary existence without drawing particular attention, the city was well suited to the task. Its scale absorbed newcomers. Its indifference to the origins of anyone who could pay rent and navigate its streets made the particulars of a person's past less scrutinized than they might have been in a smaller, more knowable place. Barsky's first employment in the United States was as a bicycle messenger. The work required minimal documentation, allowed for cash payment, and asked nothing of a new hire beyond physical capability and navigation skill. He rode through the streets of Manhattan delivering packages and envelopes to offices and buildings across the city, accumulating the small experiences of street-level New York life that would contribute to the texture of his American persona. He established bank accounts. He filed tax returns. He obtained a New York State driver's license. He signed leases and paid utility bills and received mail at addresses that established one incremental administrative document at a time, the residue of a life. He began to build the credit history and professional record that an adult American was expected to accumulate as a matter of course. The process of building this record was, in the tradecraft language his KGB training had provided, legend maintenance, the ongoing work of keeping a constructed identity consistent, current, and convincing. What his training had not fully prepared him for was the degree to which legend maintenance would, over time, become indistinguishable from simply living. Each tax return he filed was simultaneously a spycraft procedure and an ordinary adult obligation. Each bank account he managed was simultaneously cover architecture and the practical mechanism by which he paid for groceries and rent. The cover and the life were the same thing, and maintaining them required not vigilance so much as the continuation of existence in a country that was, he found, considerably more interesting than the framework in which he had been trained to understand it. The city, he later wrote, surprised him. His training had prepared him for a specific version of the United States, a version filtered through Soviet ideological frameworks that emphasized inequality, alienation, and the contradictions of capitalist society. What he found was more various, more genuinely interesting, and more human than that version had suggested. People were kind in ways he had not anticipated. Conversations were informal and direct. The texture of daily life was richer and more complex than the training had described. New York in the late 1970s was a city working through its difficulties with the particular energy of a place that has not yet decided to give up, and that energy was not what a Soviet training manual had told him to expect. He found himself, as months became years, not merely inhabiting a cover, but developing a genuine relationship with the place and the people he had been sent to observe. He enrolled in courses at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, the graduate school whose alumni and students included future American government officials, diplomats, policy analysts, and executives. The coursework served a secondary function. The primary purpose was the cultivation of contacts, the kind of relationships developed through proximity and sustained conversation over months that could eventually produce sources of intelligence about American policy thinking and institutional direction. He attended lectures. He participated in seminars. He introduced himself to fellow students and faculty with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this kind of interaction for years. His communication with Moscow followed the procedures established during his training. He received instructions from the KGB via shortwave radio transmissions broadcast on frequencies he had been provided before leaving East Germany. The transmissions were in code, encrypted using a one-time pad system in which each message was encoded with a key that was used only once and then destroyed. He decoded the transmissions in his apartment, working alone, keeping the materials carefully concealed. He transmitted intelligence and operational communications back through dead drop locations, concealed sites in public spaces where materials could be left for and retrieved by KGB handlers without requiring any direct meeting between the two parties. Riverside Park, the long green corridor running along the west side of Manhattan along the Hudson River, served as location for at least some of this dead drop activity, as Barsky has described in subsequent accounts. He would leave packages in pre-arranged locations along the park's paths, documents, handwritten reports, materials that conveyed what he had observed and learned. KGB handlers operating under cover from the Soviet mission to the United Nations in New York City, whose offices on East 67th Street in Manhattan served throughout the Cold War as a base for Soviet intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover, would retrieve the packages at intervals. The system was designed so that Barsky and his handlers never needed to be observed together, eliminating the most obvious category of evidence that surveillance of such operations tends to produce. The handler who served as Barsky's primary contact during the early years of his deployment was known to him only by the name Alex. According to Barsky's memoir, Alex was professional, precise, and attentive to operational security in ways that reflected the KGB's institutional experience with how illegal operations unraveled when protocols broke down. Meetings, when they occurred, were arranged according to strict procedures, specific locations, specific times, specific recognition signals, protocols for detecting surveillance before proceeding, and for aborting the meeting if the detection indicated risk. Alex communicated his expectations clearly and monitored Barsky's operational performance with the attentiveness of a manager whose own position depended on the quality of what his subordinate produced. What Barsky produced over the years of his New York deployment was the kind of intelligence that an illegal in his position was capable of producing: observations about American political and business culture gathered through the sustained cultivation of relationships, reports on the attitudes and intentions of people in the networks he was building, the texture and detail of institutional life in a country his handlers were attempting to understand and predict. He was not, in the conventional sense, stealing classified documents or recruiting government officials with security clearances. His value lay in the longer game, the potential of a deeply embedded illegal to serve as the foundation for more specific operations or to provide, through years of careful observation, a portrait of the country that diplomatic intelligence could not easily replicate. Somewhere in the middle years of his New York deployment, he met a woman named Penelope. The relationship that developed between them was not, according to Barsky's later account, something the KGB had anticipated or that the operational planning for his assignment had adequately addressed. He had been trained to maintain cover and to avoid attachments that could create vulnerabilities. He had been prepared for the professional dimensions of his mission. He had not been fully prepared for the ordinary human reality of spending years in a place and developing the relationships that ordinary people develop when they live somewhere long enough. Penelope and Barsky had a daughter together. Her name was Jessie. The arrival of a daughter introduced a complication that could not be managed through tradecraft or protocol. She was a child, his child. The KGB's framework for assessing this, as a vulnerability, as a potential security problem, as a complicating factor in the management of an asset, did not adequately account for what it felt like, from the inside, to be a father. Barsky has described this in terms that acknowledge both the reality of his feelings and his awareness that those feelings existed in fundamental tension with everything his assignment required of him. The KGB was aware of both the relationship and the child. According to Barsky's account, the organization monitored the situation as a complicating factor without immediately ordering him to end it. He was a long-term investment. Disruptions to his civilian life carried their own risks. The relationship with Penelope was, for a time, tolerated as a feature of the cover that helped him appear to be what he was supposed to appear to be, an ordinary American building an ordinary life. In 1984, 6 years into his American deployment, the KGB issued a recall order. The organization wanted Barsky to return, to East Germany initially, and from there to Moscow. The reasons for the recall were not explained to him in detail. The communication through his handler was simply that his assignment was being concluded and that he should prepare to leave. He refused. The decision he made in 1984 is the decision that defines everything that followed. Without it, there would be no case to describe, no family in Pennsylvania, no driveway confrontation in 1997. He chose to stay in a country he had no legal right to remain in, under a name that was not his, rather than return to the country that had sent him. The reasons, as he has given them over the years, were layered in ways that suggest he himself has not arrived at a fully settled account of them. Jesse was central. He did not want to leave his daughter. He had also developed, through 6 years of living in the United States, a relationship with the country that his original ideological framework could no longer accommodate. He was not prepared to give it up. The mechanism he chose for refusing the recall order was a lie within the larger lie of his existence. He sent the KGB a message claiming he had been diagnosed with AIDS. The disease was, in 1984, newly identified, rapidly fatal, and surrounded by the particular fear that attaches to illnesses that are not yet fully understood. An agent with AIDS was an agent whose usefulness was terminally compromised. The KGB's response, as Barsky has described it, was to withdraw the recall order. They left him in place. He did not have AIDS. He had constructed the diagnosis as a mechanism for buying himself the freedom to make a choice his handlers had not authorized. He had defied the organization that had made him, using the craft the organization had taught him to preserve the life the organization had not anticipated he would want to keep. The years following the refused recall were years of gradual transition. His relationship with Penelope ended. Contact with his daughter Jessie became sporadic and constrained by the practical impossibilities of his situation. A man living under a false identity could not be a consistently present father without risking the stability of the cover that his continued residence in the country depended on. This was a fact he could describe and had no adequate justification for. He has described it in subsequent interviews with a quality that falls somewhere between regret and reckoning. The language of someone who understands what he cost a person and does not know how to balance that understanding against the reasons that felt, at the time, like sufficient ones. He left New York. He relocated to New Jersey, where he continued to build his career in the technology sector. The rapid expansion of the personal computer industry during the 1980s created significant demand for people who could work with computing systems, and Barsky had invested in developing those skills with the same methodical attention he had applied to every other dimension of his cover. His work in New Jersey was respectable and unremarkable. He had colleagues who knew him as a competent professional and a reasonable person to share an office with. It was in this period that he met Shauna. Their relationship developed into a marriage. They built a life together in the way that people build lives together. Gradually, through the accumulation of shared experiences, the settling of domestic routines, the creation of a household that reflected the particular combination of two people's preferences and habits. They had children, Chelsea and Nikita. The family relocated to Pennsylvania in the early 1990s, settling in Lansdale. Shauna did not know her husband's real name. She did not know he had been born in East Germany. She did not know he had a wife there, or a son who was now a young adult. She did not know about Jesse in New York. She did not know about the KGB or the training or the one-time pads or the dead drops in Riverside Park. She knew Jack Barsky, a man who had built a career in technology and who was a present and engaged father to their children, and who came home in the evenings and drove to work in the mornings and participated, as far as she could tell, in exactly the life he appeared to be participating in. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. Barsky was 42 years old and living in New Jersey when it happened. The country that had sent him, the ideological framework that had given his original mission its meaning, ceased to exist in the world outside his television screen. The KGB was reorganized into successor agencies within the Russian Federation, a state that bore only partial resemblance to the one that had trained him and dispatched him 13 years earlier. The operational context of his assignment was gone. He continued living as Jack Barsky, because that was who he had become. What Barsky did not know through the late 1980s and into the 1990s was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had identified him years before he sat in that driveway on May 21st, 1997. The precise intelligence that first brought Barsky to the FBI's attention has not been fully disclosed in public documents. The case produced no public trial record, no judicial findings of fact, no discovery process through which the evidentiary foundation of the investigation became part of the public record. What is known from the FBI's own statements and from the available reporting on the case is that by approximately 1988, the Bureau had identified a man living in New Jersey under the name Jack Barsky as a suspected KGB illegal who had been operating inside the United States for a decade. The source of this identification most likely lay in the broader intelligence disruptions of the final Cold War years. The KGB's program of illegal intelligence officers, the network of people living under false identities in foreign countries, managed within the organization by what was known as Directorate S, had been compromised in various ways across its history, by defections, by double agents, by the gradual penetration of Soviet intelligence services by Western services, and, as the Cold War entered its terminal phase, by the availability of information from Allied intelligence organizations whose own records were becoming more accessible as communist governments weakened and fell. The specific mechanism by which the FBI came to focus on Barsky specifically has not been confirmed in any public account, and Barsky himself has said in interviews that the FBI told him they had known about him for years before approaching him, without fully disclosing their source. What the FBI found, when they looked carefully at the man they believed they had identified, was a situation considerably more complicated than a standard counterintelligence case. By the late 1980s, Barsky was not running an active intelligence operation. He was not making dead drops. He was not receiving shortwave transmissions or communicating with any Soviet intelligence contact, as far as investigators could determine. He was employed in a technical profession that provided no access to classified materials. He was raising a family. He was, in the assessment that FBI counterintelligence analysts assembled from their surveillance of him, a man who had been an active KGB officer years ago and who was now, whatever the legal characterization of his status, living as a private citizen without active connections to any foreign intelligence service. He was also, under federal law, in significant legal jeopardy. Entering the country under a false identity, operating as an undeclared agent of a foreign intelligence service, and using fraudulent documents to establish residency and employment were all serious federal offenses, regardless of whether the operative intelligence work had continued into the present. The statutes of limitation on such offenses did not protect him, and the nature of the crimes, ongoing identity fraud, if nothing else, meant that his exposure under federal law was not contingent on the recency of his espionage activity. The FBI spent approximately 9 years watching him. The surveillance operation that the Bureau maintained on Barsky from approximately 1988 through 1997 was patient in a way that counterintelligence work is not always patient. Patience of that kind is not passive. It requires sustained resources, continued authorization, and the institutional will to maintain a long-running operation, even when that operation is not producing the kind of dramatic developments, arrests, discoveries, confrontations, that justify surveillance programs to oversight bodies and internal managers. The FBI was watching a man live an apparently ordinary life for nearly a decade. The justification for continuing to watch had to be renewed internally against the constant pressure to close inactive cases and reallocate resources toward more active threats. Agents documented his movements, his contacts, his employer, his family situation. They noted his wife and children. They noted his daughter from his New York years. They followed him to work and documented his return. They identified his colleagues and his professional relationships. They mapped the geography of his daily life, the routes he drove, the stores he used, the places he stopped for lunch. They built a comprehensive picture of the man he had become, a man who was, by most visible measures, living something very close to an ordinary American life, with the complication of a classified biography that he was sustaining on a daily basis simply by continuing to exist under the name he had been given. The surveillance period also gave the FBI a significant advantage that would prove useful when the time for direct contact came. By 1997, the agents assigned to the case knew Barsky's routines with a degree of intimacy that he had no reason to suspect. They knew when he left for work and when he came home. They knew about Shauna and Chelsea and Nikita. They knew about his employment history. They knew about Jesse. The knowledge was the foundation of the approach they would make, and the choice to approach rather than arrest reflected a judgment that had been developing across the full 9 years of watching, that what this man could tell them was worth more than what a conviction would cost both sides. What the FBI was determining, through those 9 years, was not primarily whether he was a KGB officer. That question had been answered by the original intelligence identification. What they were determining was what the right response to him was. Arrest and prosecution was one option, but prosecution would require the government to produce its intelligence sources in a federal proceeding, a step that carries significant institutional costs when those sources involve sensitive intelligence relationships, and prosecution of a man who had not been actively spying for several years, who was raising American children with an American wife, who knew nothing of his history, who was, by his own apparent behavior, a dormant remnant rather than an active threat, was an action whose purpose required examination. The option the FBI ultimately selected was a direct approach. Walk up to him, tell him what they knew, and offer him the choice between cooperation and prosecution. It was a choice that reflected a judgment about where the greatest value lay, not in convicting him, but in debriefing him, extracting from his 19 years of experience inside the KGB's illegal intelligence program everything he knew about how that program worked, who had run it, what it had produced, and where else it might have placed people like him. The morning of May 21st, 1997 was chosen. His driveway in Lansdale was chosen. The FBI agents who arrived that morning had positioned themselves with knowledge of his schedule and his routines that 9 years of surveillance had produced. They were at his car when he came out of the front door. There was nowhere particularly convenient for him to go. One agent identified himself and his colleague. He told Barsky, according to Barsky's account, that they knew who he was. They knew where he had come from. Barsky has described his internal experience of this moment in terms that are notable for their absence of panic. He had been carrying his secret for 19 years. He had carried it through the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He had carried it through German reunification and the opening of the Stasi files and every institutional development that might reasonably have been expected to expose him. He had carried it into a second marriage and through the births of 2 more children, and through a professional career that had moved him progressively further from anything resembling the operational context of his original mission. He had been carrying it so long that part of him had perhaps begun to believe that it was simply the permanent condition of his existence. When the agents told him they knew, he said he was glad. His own account of the moment describes a quality that he characterizes as relief, the particular relief that comes from the end of concealment, from the removal of the weight of maintaining a secret so large and so comprehensive that its maintenance had become indistinguishable from the basic business of being alive. He confirmed who he was. He said his name was Albrecht Dittrich. He said he had been born on July 25th, 1949, in Glauchau, East Germany. He said he had entered the United States in October 1978 under the identity of Jack Philip Barsky and had been living in the country under that name since then. He confirmed that he had been a trained officer of the KGB. The agents arranged a time for him to come in and speak with them in more formal circumstances. He got in his car and drove to work. That evening, he sat down with Shauna and told her there were things about him she needed to know. The conversation that followed was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most difficult a person can be required to have. He was telling a woman who had married him in good faith that her understanding of who she had married was wrong in its most essential elements. His name was not Jack Barsky. He had not grown up in the United States. He had been born in East Germany and trained by Soviet intelligence and had entered the country on a stolen identity before he met her, and had never, in the years they had been together, found a moment or a framework in which telling her any of this seemed possible. He had a wife in East Germany. He had left her with their infant son without fully explaining where he was going. Their son was now a young man, approaching 30, who had grown up knowing his father only as an absence. He had a daughter in New York from a relationship before Shauna. Her name was Jessie. He had not seen her consistently. His situation had not permitted it. Shauna listened to all of this. The specific quality of her response in the immediate hours after Barsky told her has not been extensively documented in public accounts, in part because the conversation was private, and Shauna has not chosen to characterize it publicly in detail. What Barsky has described is a response that encompassed the full range of reactions that such a revelation might be expected to produce in a person of character and intelligence: shock, followed by the particular disorientation that comes when the foundational assumptions of a shared life turn out to have been built on information that was wrong in its most important dimensions, followed by questions he could not always answer adequately, followed by a silence that was different from the silences of ordinary evenings. She had married a man she believed to be an American. She had built a household with him, raised children with him, organized the practical architecture of a shared life, finances, routines, responsibilities, the accumulated decisions of years around her understanding of who he was. That understanding had now been replaced by a different understanding that was larger, stranger, and far more consequential than the original had appeared. The man was the same man. The history behind him was not the history she had been given. What is documented is that she did not leave. She remained in the marriage through the period of FBI debriefings and legal resolution that followed, and she remained in the years after. Her presence through that period is one of the consistent features of the accounts that Barsky has given, and he has spoken about it in terms that acknowledge it as something he had no right to expect and no adequate way to repay. The debriefings that followed the May 1997 driveway meeting were extensive, and by the account of everyone who participated in them, characterized by a cooperation from Barsky that was complete. He told the FBI everything they asked and more: his recruitment, his training, the false identity, the Columbia contacts, the dead drop locations, the shortwave frequencies, Alex, and the fake AIDS diagnosis that had kept him here. He had kept all of it for 19 years. He gave all of it up in a matter of months. What he provided was the full operational picture of a KGB illegal program as experienced from the inside, a perspective that was, given how rarely such officers were captured and willing to speak, of significant intelligence value to the FBI and to the broader American counterintelligence community. The Department of Justice, in assessing what to do with Barsky's case, weighed the competing considerations that such cases present. The crimes were genuine and serious. He had entered the country under a false identity, had operated as an undeclared agent of a foreign intelligence service, and had sustained both of these violations for 19 years. There was no question of the legal characterization of what he had done. On the other side of that accounting was the practical reality of what prosecution would cost and what cooperation was producing. Prosecution in a case of this kind required the government to disclose, in a public proceeding, the intelligence sources and methods that had produced the original identification. This was a cost that intelligence agencies work consistently to avoid, because the disclosure of sources tends to compromise the sources, and Barsky's active espionage work had ended years before 1997. The Soviet state he had served no longer existed, and the specific intelligence he had gathered in the late 1970s and early 1980s had long since been superseded by the passage of time and the transformation of the geopolitical landscape. The determination the government reached was not to charge him. Albrecht Dittrich, Jack Barsky, was never indicted. He was never tried. He was never sentenced to a day in federal prison. He was instead required to cooperate fully with the ongoing FBI debriefing process, which he did. He was required to regularize his immigration status, a process that took time and involved the coordination of federal agencies that had obvious institutional interest in his case. He was required, in other words, to become legal, to transform himself from an undocumented illegal alien who had been living in the country for 19 years under a stolen identity into a person with a legitimate presence in the country he had made his home. In time, he became a citizen of the United States. There were people on 2 continents who had organized their lives around assumptions about Albrecht Dittrich that turned out to be significantly incomplete. In East Germany, now, by 1997, simply part of a reunified Germany, his son Matthias had grown up without a father. Gerlinde, his first wife, had been left in 1978 with a young child, and whatever explanation, if any, she had been given for her husband's disappearance. The specific account that was provided to her at the time, and by whom, is not fully documented in public accounts of the case. What is documented is that the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and German reunification in 1990 had opened access to records and enabled the kinds of cross-border communications that had been impossible during the division. The availability of information from East German Stasi archives in the years following reunification had made it possible for people with missing relatives to begin reconstructing what had happened to them. Matthias, by the time the May 1987 driveway meeting occurred, was approaching 30 years old. He had grown up knowing his father only as an absence, a man who had left and had not come back, whose departure had not been explained in terms that a child could understand or that an adult could fully accept. The experience of growing up in that specific kind of not knowing, not the loss of a father to death or illness, but to deliberate departure, to a silence that was itself a form of deception, is not the kind of experience that resolves easily or completely. It reshapes a person's understanding of their own history and their own origin, and it does so without providing the materials necessary to build a replacement understanding. The process through which Matthias eventually learned his father was alive, and the process through which father and son made contact with each other has not been extensively documented in public sources. What Barsky has said about it in interviews is that the reunion occurred, that it was complicated in the ways that the reunion of a father and an adult son separated by decades of deliberate absence would naturally be complicated, and that it has been, in the time since, an ongoing relationship rather than a closed chapter. The complications did not dissolve. They were worked with over time in the way that such complications require to be worked with, without resolution in the clean sense, but with the possibility of something that might eventually deserve to be called understanding. In New York, Jessie, his daughter with Penelope, had grown up with a father whose presence in her life had been constrained by the practical impossibilities of his situation. The relationship between a child and a parent who cannot be fully present, who cannot explain the reasons for their absence in terms that are truthful, who must maintain a version of themselves that is constructed rather than complete, is a relationship that has costs that land most heavily on the person who did not choose the arrangement. Jessie had not chosen it. She had not chosen to have a father whose ability to be present was circumscribed by the architecture of an espionage operation. She had not chosen to have the terms of that relationship changed, without explanation adequate to the change, when Barsky relocated from New York. She had experienced those facts as the experiences of a child, without the information that would have made them comprehensible, and without the ability to demand that information from a parent who could not provide it without unraveling everything else. Barsky has spoken about Jessie in subsequent interviews with consistent acknowledgement that he was not, for the years when his situation most prevented it, the father that his daughter deserved. His contact with her had been sporadic. His ability to explain his absences or limitations was circumscribed by the very information he could not reveal. The relationship between them in the years following 1997, once the specific secrets could be disclosed, involved the particular work of renegotiating a relationship whose original terms had been established under conditions that no longer applied. This is not simple work. It does not complete on a schedule or arrive at a single moment of resolution that closes what preceded it. Chelsea and Nikita, his children with Shauna, were young when the 1997 confrontation occurred. Their understanding of what had happened and of what their father was and had been developed over the years following, calibrated to their ages and capacities as they grew. Barsky has not spoken extensively in public about their specific responses or the evolution of their understanding. Their experience of having a father who turned out to be someone significantly different from whom they had understood him to be was theirs to process, and they have not, in public accounts, chosen to characterize it at length. Shauna, who navigated all of this beside a man she had married not knowing who he was, has also not spoken publicly in extensive detail about her own experience. What the available account suggests is that she stayed, that the marriage continued, and that the family built in Pennsylvania, on a foundation that had been constructed under false pretenses in its original elements, persisted into the years after the secrets became known. In the years following 1997, Albrecht Dittrich, Jack Barsky, became something that very few KGB illegals ever become, a living, publicly accessible figure willing to speak about what he had done and what it had meant. He gave interviews to major American news organizations. He spoke on television. He became a sought-after commentator on the mechanics and human dimensions of Cold War intelligence operations, a person who could describe from the inside what the production of an illegal intelligence officer involved, what the experience of living as one was like, and what the dissolution of the ideological framework that had produced him had felt like from inside the life it had generated. He published his memoir in 2017 under the title Deep Undercover: My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America, through Tyndale House Publishers. The book provided the most comprehensive public account available of his experience, from his recruitment in Jena through his years in New York, his decision to stay in 1984, his family life in Pennsylvania, the FBI confrontation, and the years of reconstruction that followed. He wrote it in the clear, accessible English of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades perfecting a language that was not his native one and had, somewhere in the middle of those decades, made it his own. The memoir placed the Barsky case in a category occupied by very few Cold War espionage accounts, first-person testimony from an illegal intelligence officer who had survived the Cold War, survived the dissolution of the organization that had trained him, and survived the exposure of his identity, and who was willing to describe the experience in full. Most illegal operations ended differently, in arrest, in death, in exchanges that returned an officer to a country that no longer existed in the form that had sent them, or in permanent disappearance into a new identity in a new place. Barsky's case ended with his continued presence in the country he had been sent to penetrate, writing about the experience for an American publisher and giving interviews to American television programs. The irony of this outcome was not lost on him, and he has addressed it in his public appearances with a self-awareness that suggests he has spent considerable time thinking about what it means. The case attracted attention in popular culture as well as in intelligence and policy circles. When the television drama The Americans, a series centered on KGB illegals living in suburban Virginia in the 1980s, was in production, creators and writers acknowledged that real cases, including the Barsky case, had informed the series. The show ran from 2013 to 2018 and was widely noted for the accuracy of its portrayal of the tradecraft and the human dimensions of living under deep cover. Barsky has spoken about the show in interviews, noting both where it captured dimensions of his experience and where it diverged from the specific reality of his own case. He had obtained American citizenship by the time the memoir appeared. The man who had entered the country in October 1978 on the stolen identity of a Brooklyn child who died in 1955, had become through a process that required the cooperation of the same federal government that had surveilled him for 9 years and elected not to prosecute him, a citizen of the country he had been sent to penetrate. He was still called Jack Barsky. The name was the one thing from the original construction that had not been reassigned or renegotiated. It had been his, in some significant sense, long enough that it had become his. The case of Albrecht Dittrich does not resolve cleanly into the categories that Cold War espionage narratives typically provide. There is no hero and no villain in the straightforward sense. There is no single crime and punishment, no clear accounting in which what was taken is repaid and the ledger closes. What there is, instead, is a man who made choices inside a system that provided him with a framework in which those choices seemed reasonable, and who then found himself living with the consequences of those choices in a context. The actual daily texture of American life, the reality of being a father, the accumulated weight of human relationships entered into without full honesty, that his original framework had not been designed to accommodate. He chose to accept the KGB's offer at Friedrich Schiller University. He chose to leave East Germany and his wife and his infant son without telling them the truth. He chose to enter the United States under a stolen identity. He chose, in 1984, to defy the recall order and to stay, a choice that preserved the life he had built at the cost of deepening the deception he had been practicing. He chose to marry Shauna without telling her who he was. He chose, for 19 years, to maintain the construction that had been built for him and that he had continued building. These choices had consequences for people who had not made them. Gerlinde did not choose to have her husband disappear. Matthias did not choose to grow up without a father. Jessie did not choose the particular constrained relationship with her father that his situation imposed on her. Shauna did not choose to build a life on a foundation whose actual character was hidden from her. Chelsea and Nikita did not choose to have their understanding of their father's identity renegotiated while they were still children. And yet the choices Dittrich made were the choices of a person formed inside a total ideological system, recruited at an age when formation is most complete, shaped by training that was designed to make those choices feel not only acceptable but morally correct. The East Germany he had grown up in did not present alternative frameworks with equal force. The KGB he had joined did not invite debate about the legitimacy of its methods. He had been given a single lens through which to understand what he was doing and why it mattered, and he had used that lens for the years in which such lenses tend to stick. This does not remove his responsibility. It does complicate the accounting. There is a question that the Barsky case makes impossible to avoid, even if it cannot be definitively answered. What would have happened if the FBI had arrested him rather than approached him? The legal answer is straightforward: prosecution, likely conviction, a federal sentence measured in years or decades. Shauna and Chelsea and Nikita would have faced the particular public exposure that attaches to the family of a convicted spy. Matthias and Jesse would have learned about their father through newspaper accounts rather than from him. The debriefing intelligence the FBI extracted over months of voluntary cooperation would not have been extracted, or would have been extracted under far more adversarial conditions, likely to produce less. The outcome the government chose, approach, cooperate, absorb, cost less and produced more by almost any measure, but it also required the government to treat a man who had committed serious federal crimes as a person whose cooperation was more valuable than his conviction. The families of other people convicted of espionage, people who did not have the specific profile that made cooperation attractive to the FBI, might reasonably note that the calculus applied to Barsky was not universally applied. The consistency question is one the public record does not answer. The FBI's decision not to prosecute him reflected a practical calculation, as such decisions always do. But it also reflected, perhaps, a recognition that the categories available, espionage, arrest, trial, sentence, were not fully adequate to the specific case in front of them. A man who had been an intelligence officer but had not actively spied in years. A man whose families on 2 continents were going to bear the consequences of whatever the government did. A man who was, by the time 2 agents stood in his driveway, so thoroughly embedded in the country he had originally come to observe that prosecuting him meant prosecuting someone who was, in almost every practical sense, American. He was 29 years old when he walked across a border with someone else's name and someone else's history. He was 47 when two men told him they knew who he was. He was 67 when his memoir appeared, and he began to tell the story himself, in public, in a country that had decided he was allowed to stay. In between, he was Albrecht Dittrich in a country that did not know it, and Jack Barsky in a life that did not know why. He lost the country he was born in before it technically ceased to exist. He lost years with a son he had left behind, and years with a daughter he could not fully be present for, and years with a wife in Pennsylvania who had been living without knowing it alongside a secret large enough to rearrange everything she thought she understood. He did not lose the country he had been sent to observe. He stayed there. He built a life there that, for all its compromised foundations, was real in the way that lives built over decades become real, through the accumulation of ordinary days, through the relationships that endure, through the particular weight of having been somewhere long enough that somewhere becomes home. Jack Barsky is alive. He is an American citizen. He goes by the name of a child who died in Brooklyn in 1955, and in some sense, the legal sense, the daily sense, the sense of having lived a life under that name for more than 4 decades. The name is his now. Whether the same can be said in reverse, whether the country is his in the way that the name is his, whether what he took from it was balanced by what he ultimately gave to it, is not a question the record answers. It belongs to the people who lived inside it with him, who built their lives alongside his, who carried the weight of what he was without knowing they were carrying it, and to Albrecht Dittrich himself, who has been living with the answer long enough to know that he does not have one, and has said so in a language that is not the one he was born speaking, in a country that was not the one he was born into, with a name that was not the one he was given.